I'd like to just welcome everybody to our talk, and I'd like to introduce you to our speaker today, who is Dr. Candis Callison. Her talk today is the 12-year window, locating crisis. Locating crisis, climate change, and colonialism. She is associate professor in the School of Journalism and the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies at the University of British Columbia. She is the author of this book. Let's see, can everybody see this book? Sort of. There it is, something like that, which is How Climate Change Comes to Matter, the Communal Life of Facts, and also has a book that just came out this year, Reckoning Journalism's Limits and Possibilities. Welcome, Candis, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to everybody who organized this speaker series that I'm part of too. I want to speak a little bit in my Indigenous language. Tausadan Dedene de Otsi, Teskia Ezetsai, Chochalona Hote. It's still good morning here, and I'm Taltan from the Crow clan. What you're looking at on the screen right now is an image from where our traditional territory is. It's in northwestern British Columbia, so kind of where the Yukon, Alaska, and British Columbia meet. But I am actually speaking to you from, just get my slides going here, from Musqueam land. So from the University of British Columbia, which is in Vancouver, and the lands around Vancouver are home to Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And I also want to acknowledge the care and ongoing relations of the land you're on. So the traditional territory of the Caddo Nation and Wichita and affiliated tribes. And I understand that the lands around your university once also served Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, and Osage nations, and that 39 tribal nations dwell in the state of Oklahoma as a result of settler colonial policies in the US. And I'm really thankful for learning this by distance. I was looking forward to being there with you in person to learn some of this up close and personal. I know a little bit about the history in Oklahoma and obviously about American Indigenous history, but I was really, I was really disappointed to not be there, but also grateful that Suzanne got me a draft of the land acknowledgement that I understand is in process there. So for many years, I've begun my talks this way, whether I'm talking in the US or Canada, with an acknowledgement of traditional territory and a few words from my own language. And I start this way for a couple of reasons. First, and most importantly, because it's Indigenous protocol to do so. Here on the West Coast, we situate ourselves and we acknowledge our relations. Second, it's substantive to what I'm talking about, to acknowledge the ongoing challenges, deep history, and legacies of colonialism, like displacement, forced migrations, broken or non-existent treaties, and intergenerational trauma that gets shifted off to the side, swallowed up, or subsumed by crises like climate change. Even while, as many Indigenous leaders, communities, and scholars have pointed out, climate change amplifies the vulnerabilities that colonialism and its legacies have produced. It's with this as context that I want to think more closely about climate change as a story, a crisis, and an evolving global problem. Now, most of our minds have likely been full of COVID-19 and all the related news, information, and inconveniences that we're all experiencing. So you may have missed it that this week is also the 50th anniversary of the first ever Earth Day. The image that you're looking at right now is called the Blue Marble. It came from the Apollo 17 mission in 1972. This is the last manned flight to the moon and a couple years after the first Earth Day in 1970. Images like this one of Earth suspended in its solar system have long been credited with a shift in our conceptualization of the planet, giving primacy to environmental borders instead of political ones. Images like this have also contributed to a sense of the planet as vulnerable and at risk. So it's not surprising that the anniversary of Earth Day has also become an opportunity to talk about climate change, a problem that is global in scope and impacts. And here's an example from the New York Times, one of the few newspapers in the US that still has a science section. I put it up because they're also asking some key questions that heavily resonate with the research I've been doing for the last couple of decades, in particular with this notion of the state of crisis that we're said to be in with climate change. And also, secondarily, this question of how we know what we know. I asked this question about journalists and scientists as well as social movements. Now, for those of you not deeply embedded in the climate change discourse, 2018 was a big year for talking about climate change as a crisis. In the fall of 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its 1.5 degree warming report that announced we had 12 years to make major progress on climate change. The IPCC began issuing its assessments in 1990, and unlike its previous reports, this latest one offered something more concrete, a time frame for action on climate change, stating that the next 12 years are crucial to slowing climate change. The IPCC projects, quote, with a high confidence, unquote, that global temperatures will increase by 1.5 degrees Celsius between 2030 and 2052, and that, quote, far-reaching transitions in energy, land, urban, and infrastructure, including transport and buildings, and industrial systems, unquote, are required before 2030 in order to avoid further increases in temperature. The decade we now have left in this 12-year window dramatically collapses any kind of slow-mo feeling anyone might have had previously. And it's hardly an accidental move on the part of IPCC scientists. I'm just going to move my screen so I can see my slides. Hold on here. As Deborah Roberts, a co-chair for the Working Group on Impacts, told The Guardian, a UK-based news source, it's a line in the sand. And what it says to our species is that this is the moment, and we must act now. This is the largest clarion bell from the science community, and I hope it mobilizes people and dents the mood of complacency. The Guardian headlined this report, "We have 12 years to limit climate change catastrophe," warns UN. The highlights, illustrated by a helpful IPCC sliding scale, organized according to temperature, includes, after 1.5 degrees, loss of coral reefs, extreme warming in the Arctic, major threats to ecosystems worldwide, and steep increases in severe weather events. The IPCC isn't the only organization to recently draw such a line in the sand. In May 2019, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, released its first global assessment, citing climate change as a major driver that is exacerbating already significant biosphere degradation from industrial development. The IPBES stated that over 1 million species are at risk. Like IPCC author Roberts, IPBES author Sandra Diaz told National Geographic, the evidence is crystal clear. Nature is in trouble. Therefore, we are in trouble. IPBES task force leader and group expert Robert Watson was more pointed when he talked to the Washington Post. He said, we need to link it to human well-being. That's the crucial thing. Otherwise, we're going to look like a bunch of tree huggers. God forbid you should look like a tree or you should want to hug a tree during a time of crisis. It's clear that the world isn't going to end in what is now 10 years left on that 12-year window. But what makes such a window worth paying attention to, in the opinion of many scholars and scientists, is that it lights a fire for change in society within a time frame that's comprehensible. The challenge of amplifying and articulating climate change as a crisis, I'm just going to go down my slide list a little bit here. The challenge of amplifying and articulating climate change as a crisis that explains a few disasters already underway or forecast is not insignificant. And how to talk about climate change is something I've been studying for a long time now. Framing climate change as urgent, as crisis, and impending disaster are ultimately discursive shifts intended to move publics, media, and policymakers towards action, prioritization, and maybe, in the most hopeful scenario, panic. As ironic as that may seem, given the measures undertaken to underscore certainty and trust in the evidence presented, for example, IPCC labels all claims with a degree of confidence. As several scientists I heard talk in the mid 2000s used to say, there's nothing wrong with panic if the house is on fire. And worry about house fires is why we prepare by buying fire insurance. But here's the larger challenge in focusing only on panic or the need to prepare. Crisis talk fundamentally limits questions about how we got here and what happened to focus on what must be done in order to avert the disaster upon us. And crucially, where, how, and when to locate climate change as a crisis, and deciding whether it's a crisis, what kind, and for whom, is not just a question for scientists or economists, but also for those who study media, power, social structures, and history. What historians and social scientists have continually reminded us in studies of the recent and distant past is that how, why, and for whom something gets labeled as crisis or impending disaster is a fraught process, and one that excludes and prioritizes some data and some voices over others in order to arrive at actionable agendas. Articulations of crises are informed by existing social structures and histories, laden with power relations, geography, and institutional reach and prerogatives, even as real suffering and loss hang in the balance. How a crisis is configured demarcates where and when a disaster begins, what the scope of it is, and where and who is most impacted by predicted doom and disasters already underway. Climate change is no exception in any of these regards. While the 12-year window as a talking point or panic-inducing drive to make big changes might seem like a solution to many of the challenges that have plagued getting diverse publics engaged, it also perpetuates dominant ways of talking about climate change that don't take into account diverse understanding, knowledge, and assessment of ecological changes. In order to get at this larger question, or these larger questions of how we got to crisis as a primary way we talk about climate change, I'm going to start with a brief overview of public engagement and media coverage of climate change. And then I want to move to thinking about frameworks suggested by Indigenous scholars and communities that are grounded in interdependent, reciprocal relations between humans and non-humans. At the end of it, I'm going to bring these themes together and talk about how discourse and reporting on the Anthropocene, a close relative of climate change, might provide some insight into telling different kinds of stories. My proposition for you is threefold. First, that a consideration of Indigenous knowledges, experiences, and histories offers profound relational and historical context for understanding the crises and disasters associated with climate change. Second, acknowledging settler colonialism and its structures are essential to discussions about how to consider what must, should, and can be done about climate change. Third, how we talk about climate change is caught up in history and societal structure in a way that can't be set aside as the ethics conversation in the corner or the background of doing science or doing journalism about science. Okay, so first thing, how do we get to this label of crisis? Let's start with media. In the more than 25-year history of figuring out how to rouse the attention of global publics, media, and policymakers, as Deborah Roberts' quote makes clear, the challenge is that climate change has been perceived as part of some hazy, still mostly uncertain future that doesn't generate the immediate concern triggered by stressors such as COVID-19, economic woes, wars, or crime. In journalism terms, as many have told me over the years, climate change is a story that oozes, it doesn't break. In my previous book, I focused on how journalists, scientists, and social groups talk about and mobilize publics to engage with climate change, and how expertise gets translated for and taken up by non-experts. The book argues for a communal life of facts, as the subtitle gives away. Now, for this book, I did ethnographic research with 5 groups that were not only place-based. So I talked to journalists and scientists, but I also talked to leaders of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, leaders associated with Creation Care, which was an American evangelical movement in the mid-2000s, And the fifth group was Ceres, which is a corporate social responsibility group. They were the ones who took climate change and made it climate risk for Wall Street. And each of these groups that I talked to thought about climate change and talked about climate change in a very particular way that spoke to the publics they wanted to speak to, but also spoke to wider groups as well. What I came out of that book with was that climate change poses a double bind. It must maintain fidelity to the scientific context from which it arises, and it must be invested with meaning, ethics, and morality in order for a rationale to act to emerge amongst diverse publics that may or may not prize science the way that this crowd probably does. Part of that conclusion stems from one of the primary concerns I encountered, particularly among journalists and scientists. And that is the challenge of communicating science when news requires certainty and also seeks to produce awareness, often with little deep engagement, except to signpost dangers for those most in peril of some kind. Particularly in media-saturated states, and I'm just going to move back to this graph of the last 20 years of climate coverage. So particularly in media-saturated Western states, those skeptical of or in denial about climate change have utilized this challenge not only to question climate science as uncertain and non-specific, but also to frame demands for action on climate change as too alarmist. Journalists have often been caught in the middle, navigating a spectrum anchored on one end by those saying news about climate change isn't doing enough to garner appropriate public concern and political action, and derided on the other by those who see climate change as an issue requiring more proof before action can be contemplated. Not only that, journalists are beholden to an industry devoted to news values, such as timeliness, impact, and novelty, which help to determine what news is and how it should be told, preferably by telling both sides of the story, even when there's more than two or less than two. News forms and styles have continually opened up climate change to counterclaims, and at the same time demanded certainty and newness in order to be deemed worthy of attention. This is the world of discourse that 12 degrees with a high degree of confidence has entered. And while it isn't exactly breaking news, it does potentially shift the framing of climate change by introducing a countdown clock for which goals can be set, progress can be measured, and accountability enacted. For journalists working in the US during the last 2 decades, where denialism and lack of concern was high compared to other Western democracies, this is, pardon the term, good news. In the US, and to a lesser extent, other national contexts like Canada and Australia, where denialists have also been active, journalists have wrestled with publics used to textbook-like scientific facts and unused to developing a relationship with evolving climate facts that have been occasionally revised, but more often elaborated and affirmed. Separate from climate, the news industry has also been embroiled in its own crisis, beset by changes in economic models, new platforms, changing audience habits and expectations related to the rise of digital media beginning at the turn of this century. With the power, reach, and credibility of mainstream news becoming less certain, an issue like climate change provides a kind of case study for what media can and should do to educate, engage, and inspire their audiences. In the wake of the release of the National Academy of Sciences' fourth assessment report in November 2018, the Columbia Journalism Review argued that climate change connections should be articulated when reporting on all environmental concerns, and especially high-profile disasters like forest fires in California, which have clear climate change associations and related predictions. This was borne out in the devastating fires in Australia as well this past winter. Linking climate change to weather-related disasters makes good news sense, and it's proven a reliable wake-up call for those impacted by and aware of what fires, floods, hurricanes, and drought look like and what it means in terms of human, economic, and environmental loss. Communicating science and navigating news norms and practices aren't the only problem affecting climate change, however. Indeed, thinking about climate change only as a science issue or even a science policy economic issue, may in fact be a huge part of the problem of sustaining the attention of publics and policymakers. I'd argue instead that public engagement with climate change should also be configured as a history problem, in the sense that climate change does not stand outside the varied social context from which it has emerged, nor can climate change be fully addressed without recognizing how deeply rooted ecological problems are in colonialism. And you'll see that Luke Pearson in this op-ed for The Guardian has made a very similar argument. Scientific knowledge is predicated on a particular approach to historical and ongoing relations with humans and non-humans that are rarely examined. Yet these relations are essential to thinking and talking about long-term catastrophes associated with climate change. Indeed, what frames get put around the climate crisis, whether as explanation, prediction, or solution, reflect how we configure human relations and histories, and what gets or has been constituted as a crisis, both present and future. For example, citizen Potawatomi scholar Kyle Powys-White has suggested that the urgency indicative of climate change discourse reflects a Western settler logic and doesn't recognize the apocalypse that Indigenous people have been living through since colonization began in the Americas and obviously elsewhere in the globe. In Indigenous communities like my own, which have also suffered from forest fires in the last couple of years, and communities in the Arctic where I've conducted research, climate change is not a first epic ecological disaster, nor is it understood as a standalone issue. Rather, recent observations, experiences, and scientific findings related to climate change layer onto oral histories and traditional stories that discuss ecological change in the distant past. These stories are also deeply connected to more recent histories of settler colonial dispossession of lands and waters and ensuing disruption of relations between humans and non-humans. Globally, Indigenous people will experience the impacts of climate change directly, forcefully, and well before more insulated, less rural, less northern, or less southern centers of commerce and power. Forest fires, droughts, floods, sea level rise, storms, permafrost melt, and other ecosystem changes have already impacted all aspects of human and non-human lives. In diverse Indigenous worldviews, these lives are interdependent and reliant on deeply reciprocal relations. These relations, which have been described in scholarship as Indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge, have until very recently been largely ignored by the IPCC and other climate research and policy institutions. It's only in the fifth assessment that traditional knowledge features, and it is largely framed as a resource to combine with science or as an extension of the historical record. In contrast, the Anishinaabe scholar Deborah McGregor argues, one does TEK, traditional ecological knowledge. It is not limited to a body of knowledge, non-Aboriginal, and Aboriginal is a term used in Canada interchangeably with Indigenous or First Nations or Native. So non-Aboriginal views of traditional ecological knowledge are more concerned with what the knowledge consists of and how it is transmitted. TEK is not just knowledge about the relationships with creation, it is the relationship with creation. It is the way that one relates. And here's where history begins to matter for climate change in particular. It's this way of relating that was thrown into crisis with the genocides, destruction, and violence that accompanied the expansion of colonial empires worldwide, long before climate change appeared as a concern. Kim Tallbear recently pointed out on a Media Indigenous podcast, which I also participate in, that the genocides in the Americas are not just among humans, but also among non-humans. Non-humans, so plants, animals, land, water, etc., are considered by many diverse Indigenous communities as relatives or kin, as opposed to the species line drawn in Western science that creates an us and a them, the proverbial nature-culture divide. As Tallbear notes, colonialism and its attendant genocides, dispossession, and violence happen to both Indigenous humans and our non-human relatives. I'm just not able to see where the next slide is, hold on here. Indigenous studies scholars have defined settler colonialism as a particular form of colonialism. And I'm just going to put a definition up there. You may have encountered settler colonialism in your readings and in your studies, but I often like to put the definition up just to remind us that settler colonialism is a particular form of colonialism where settlers came, stayed, and enacted processes and structures that continue to govern societies. In other words, colonialism is not an event in the distant past, but rather a persistent disruption and dispossession of lands and waters that seeks to erase Indigenous presence, histories, knowledge, and people. Geographer Heather Davis and Cree Métis scholar Zoe Todd have argued that the Anthropocene should be conceived as having its genesis with colonialism, in part because the Anthropocene as a concept reflects colonial logics that erase difference and enforce universalist ideas, often with brutal force. They build on Kyle White's work, which argues that, quote, the Anthropocene can be viewed as a continuation of, rather than a break from, previous eras that begin with colonialism and extend through advanced capitalism. It's in this sense that settler colonialism provides a historical and conceptual terrain in which to understand climate change as situated in relations deeply impacted by histories, processes, and enduring structures and systems. Settler colonialism as a terrain intervenes in histories and ongoing discursive moves of considering what and who is in crisis. When scholars and scientists talk about climate change in terms of a disruption to normal and to what is stable, this is the essence of deeming it a crisis. But stability is a cultural concept and framework for thinking about weather and climate. Most scientists who work in climate tend to look for what and where the patterns are, to see what has changed and what will change, and whether we can attribute that change to some variables more than others. Models are often only as good as what variables they take into account and how much of the historical record they can include to show change over time. Many Indigenous communities in North America also talk about and have mental models for assessing change. This kind of thinking is embedded in diverse traditional stories about how things were, how things change, and what it means when things do change. And when things go badly, it's often linked to or explained as humans and non-humans falling out of good relations. Humans have a responsibility to act right, and there are rituals associated with acting right that extend and articulate what a framework for responsibility and reciprocation look like in diverse Indigenous contexts. Yet, dominant scientific frameworks for climate models and simulations are the primary public modes of learning about environmental factors. Rarely, if ever, do scientific frameworks offer an adjudication of what humans could, should, or must do, as if there is an ongoing set of physical, cultural, and spiritual relationships between humans, non-humans, and more than humans. The context of or for relations, as well as attendant responsibilities to maintain these relations, are not part of scientific frameworks. I would expand this more broadly by suggesting that what gets passed over when we think in a narrow sense of climate change as imminent disaster is that while scientific in origin, climate predictions have the potential to introduce and sustain larger moral, ethical, and epistemological questions for everyone, not only Indigenous people. Climate science, even if heralding imminent disaster, doesn't come without epistemological concerns or commitments, nor does it, like all of Western science, emerge as historically disconnected from either industrial development, the emergence of nation states, transnational institutions, or colonialism. Climate change can and does make such relations and histories of relations more visible. However, at the current moment, much of the public discourse related to climate change elides, ignores, or erases the historical, structural, and epistemological. Michael Bravo, who studied the Arctic quite a bit, had this to say in 2009, that the climate change narrative is, quote, built exclusively on the language of scientific expertise and physical causation, and is not equipped to deal with politically, economically, legally, and socially complex responses. And this adds to what STS scholars have been saying for quite some time about science and democracy. Rebecca Ellis, Claire Waterton, and Brian Wynn in 2010 stated that experiments in democratizing science have ironically served to reinstate the authority of science by subtle means, involving erasure of the very publics being invited to participate. And this is where journalists working in many discursive spaces and media perhaps have an even greater role to play than merely reporting the facts about climate change or educating publics about how such facts evolve. And I might argue equally that scientists looking to engage publics should also consider how and what kind of sedimentation they're building on, and what kinds of turns must be made to address for whom and in what context is usability considered. Keeping in mind, of course, that standardization and centralization, the kinds of issues at the core of usability and service models, which is now become the dominant way of thinking about climate services, have rarely, if ever, served those on the margins of society and power. And with that, I want to move to thinking more closely about the Anthropocene in order to think through these suggestions. Originally proposed as a distinct era in an article by Paul Crutzen and Eugene Stormer in 2000, the concept of the Anthropocene, as its name suggests, was intended to, quote, denote the present geological time interval, unquote, defined by the massive impact human actions are having on all aspects of Earth's systems. In a follow-up article in 2002, Crutzen placed the move from the Holocene to the Anthropocene, the so-called golden spike at the end of the 18th century, quote, when analysis of air trapped in polar ice showed the beginning of growing global concentrations of carbon dioxide and methane, unquote. Despite nearly 2 decades of debate over how and what this means, all while ignoring the power relations inherent in deciding just when human impact began to matter in terms of geological epochs, here the golden spike has stayed. Debates about when the Anthropocene began and whether it marked a new geological epoch came to a close of sorts for many who work on geological research and adjacent fields in May 2019, when the Anthropocene Working Group, AWG, submitted the binding vote of its 33 members. The AWG vote report hinted at dissent from other scholars, presumably including Davis, Todd, and White, whom I cited earlier, by stating, the Anthropocene has developed a range of meanings among vastly different scholarly communities. Such debates and the proliferation of the Anthropocene as a conceptual and organizing concept reiterate the conclusions of many social studies of science, specifically that scientific facts are co-constituted and co-produced with and within social orders and cultural and political contexts. Yet science still maintains a kind of authority in these co-productions, to use Sheila Jasanoff's term, and primacy in how to apprehend the other than human world through and with science only. The turn to a 12-year window and to the Anthropocene are not dissimilar in this sense. They orient our view of the non-human world to scientific evidence and the catastrophes that are predicted through such evidence. In his thorough analysis of the development of the concept of the Anthropocene, historian Dipesh Chakrabarty concludes this way, quote, it is not that we have not known of catastrophes in the geological history of the planet. We have, but the knowledge did not affect our quotidian sense of an innate assurance that the Earth provides a stable ground on which we project our political purposes. The Anthropocene disturbs that certainty by bringing the geological into the everyday. In contrast, following Robin Wall-Kimmerer or Deborah McGregor, Kyle White, Zoe Todd, and Kim Tallbear, all Indigenous scholars whom I've referenced in this talk, who have looked closely at Indigenous knowledge and lifeways alongside scientific rationales and methods diverse Indigenous methodologies might arrive at a quite different response. Namely, if we extend their work to climate change and build on their interventions, I'd argue that the stability of the Earth depends not on stability as a thing in and of itself, but rather on relations and responsibilities between humans and non-humans. Thus, it follows our assurance of stability should stem from continual assessment of the state of these myriad relations. Such an approach rests on the assumption that the geological is present and in the everyday through Indigenous knowledge, lifeways, and stories. Stability is not the foundation, but rather a result of being in good relations, something that must be maintained and worked towards. Kimmer, a citizen Potawatomi biologist, begins her book Braiding Sweetgrass with the story of Sky Woman in order to orient the reader to this other way of reciprocal thinking and to Indigenous knowledges, languages, and epistemologies. This is the weighty distinction in considering lands, waters, animals, and others as non-human relatives for whom and with whom there are reciprocal obligations. In such a framework, crisis is located not in the presentation of symptomatic evidence only, but rather considered alongside diagnoses arrived at through analyses of relations, responsibilities, and reciprocity. Stability is something not just to track and evidence as in peril, where disasters mount and add to the panic. Rather, stability becomes a shared goal that requires constant maintenance. In their discussion of the Anthropocene, Davis and Todd articulate it this way. I don't have that quote up there. So in their discussion of the Anthropocene, Davis and Todd articulate it this way. What settler colonialism and its extensions into contemporary petrocapitalism does is a severing of relations. It is a severing of relations between humans and the soil, between plants and animals, between minerals and our bones. This is the logic of the Anthropocene, unquote. This logic, begun and intensified with multiple genocides throughout the Americas, was first suggested as an Orbis spike by geographers Mark Maislin and Simon Lewis, who proposed that, quote, colonialism, global trade, and coal brought about the Anthropocene. They further suggest that the formal definition of the Anthropocene makes scientists arbiters to an extent of the human-environment relationship, itself an act with consequences beyond geology, unquote. Maislin and Lewis contributed to another study released in March 2019 that looked at the impacts of the deaths of 56 million Indigenous people between 1492 and 1610, and the subsequent land and vegetation changes that resulted. They conclude that, quote, the great dying of the Indigenous peoples of the Americas resulted in a human-driven global impact on the Earth system in the 2 centuries prior to the Industrial Revolution, unquote. In such a view, regional distinctions vanish, as do individual stories of dispossession, violence, and genocide. The climate crisis and the Anthropocene are both evidenced by and intimately intertwined with a concept relative to their conceptual scope, settler colonialism. And herein lies the larger challenge of how to talk about and report on the climate crisis as imminent disaster. That is, the challenge lies not only in how to educate and/or report to publics on scientific facts, but how to co-account for the histories of genocide, impacting human and non-human populations and their relations that also undergird the founding of nation states and empires, and how constituted such empires currently are in much further reaching multinational industries. In my recent co-authored book, Reckoning, Journalism's Limits and Possibilities with my UBC colleague, Mary Lynn Young, we suggest that journalists need to both situate themselves and recognize the harms and persistent critiques of journalism as part of an overall shift in methods towards what we term systems journalism. And this becomes crucial when you consider climate change and how disconnected it often is in media from the histories of colonialism and capitalism, even as concepts like the Anthropocene have also become useful terms to conceptualize ecological changes deeply linked to climate change. Here is where some comparative analysis of journalism might further elucidate this point. When CNN reported on the article from Meslin and Lewis, they led the report this way. And actually, they weren't the lead authors. There's a couple of other authors. But when CNN reported on the article I just mentioned, they led the report this way. Quote, when Europeans arrived in the Americas, they caused so much death and disease that it changed the global climate, a new study finds. European settlers killed 56 million indigenous people over 100 years in South, Central, and North America, causing large swaths of farmland to be abandoned and reforested. Researchers at University College London, or UCL, estimate. In this article, genocide is news because there is evidence of the impact genocide had on lands and on scientific conclusions about the impact of humans on lands. In contrast, consider the way Mark Jahan, editor of Indian Country Today, led his article on the report. Quote, the destruction of the indigenous world has been chronicled ever since Bartolomé de las Casas wrote a short account of the destruction of the Indies in 1552. He even described more than 30 other islands in the vicinity of San Juan are for the most part and for the same reason depopulated and the land laid waste. On these islands, I estimate there are 2,100 leagues of land that have been ruined and depopulated, empty of people. Now, a new study adds hard data, documenting the global cost of colonialism. In this article, scientific evidence underscores what was already part of the written historical record, and consequently, the story, experts, and questions to ask are configured quite differently. So too, by extension, is the matter of how to think about what climate change is as a crisis for humans, non-humans, and their ways of relating. Reading these two very different takes caused me to reflect on what I encountered well over a decade ago when I first began talking with Inuit leaders and communities who were at that time bringing a human rights petition regarding the impact of climate change on Inuit lifeways. Climate change, while a recognized phenomenon by whalers, berry pickers, hunters, and others with traditional knowledge, expertise, also arrived with its institutions, language, and configurations of how to bound and define what was the problem, and in turn, what was at stake. Climate change became yet another layer on top of existing crises, geopolitical maneuvering, and particular experiences with colonialism that Inuit leaders and communities had to navigate in order for their concerns to be heard in policy, adaptation planning, and scientific research forums. This analysis situates scientific findings within historicized experiences with colonialism. Similarly, sets climate change within a relational and historical framework. Not unlike the IPBES's warning that I began with that suggests climate change exacerbates species loss in already stressed ecosystems, climate change is a disaster and crisis because it is layered onto already severed and stressed relations. The discursive frame for compelling action is thus not what should we do, but how do we relate? And how do we address where our responsibilities lie? And where or when the historical breakdowns in these relations occurred. This also provides a differentiated pathway to a set of ethical and substantive diagnostics about how and what kind of stories journalism is telling about the worlds we inhabit in the present and past, and in future imagined worlds. The Anthropocene, climate change, all provide discursive and very real moves to explain our present. And in thinking with Indigenous knowledge and settler colonialism, I am suggesting that the urgency now assigned to climate change hasn't emerged outside of historical context for its own knowledge production. Nor should the climate crisis get a pass on or from the histories it must contend with. Who gets to narrate exactly what is in crisis and how is a discussion worth having, as is how we think about change historically and as a lead up to the present. It's in these conversations that we might also find our way to a more compelling, deeply historical frame for public engagement with and about climate change. And I'll just give you a word from my sponsors. And I'll end with an image from Tahltan country again.